Hello, this is Rabbi Raphael Zarum from the London School of Jewish Studies speaking to you. And for my little TED presentation in preparation for Shavuot, I wanted to talk about the Ten Commandments, the Aseret HaDibrot. And I've got my notes in my book here to go through it with you. And I want to ask maybe an obvious question, but I think it's worth asking. And the question is this: what's so special about the Ten Commandments? Because if I'm honest and we look at them, they're not really that original. I don't believe that no other society had thought of do not murder, do not steal, do not commit perjury or adultery, infidelity, had occurred until that time. And in fact, we know that other societies had that. If we look at the cuneiform tablets and Mesopotamian from Mesopotamia and the hieroglyphic writings of the ancient Egyptians, which are contemporary with the period of revelation of Sinai, 13th, 14th century BCE, they had these similar laws already written down, the Hammurabi Code and other examples of it. Contemporary cultures having a system of law, of rules, led by the authority. In which case, what's so special about the Ten Commandments? I mean, even for us, by the way, we'd begun to keep Shabbat before Mount Sinai. We know not gathering manna in the wilderness wasn't allowed on the Shabbat day. It had to be collected on the Friday. This is chapter 16 of Exodus. We already had laws of Shabbat even before the Ten Commandments. So what made it special back then? And also, you might have heard of the 7 Noahide laws. These are the laws, there are actually 6 to Adam and 1 were added to Noah. The Gemara in Sanhedrin talks about this. These 7 Noahide laws, basic laws that all society has to do in terms of setting up law courts, also not murdering, not blaspheming God and so on. And if you go through the 7 Noahide laws, 5 of them are in the Ten Commandments. So within contemporary general culture, and even recognized by the rabbis, there are pre-existing laws that cover half, even more, of the Ten Commandments. So what's so new about them? Why suddenly is it this great moment that we hear the Ten Commandments, the Aseret HaDibrot, given at Mount Sinai? Why are those 10 made the issues? So when I thought about this, I actually have a different kind of answer. For me, the Ten Commandments, the greatness of them is not in their originality, it's in how they get involved with the messiness of human life. What do I mean by that? Well, what's an interesting question to ask is, how many of our great heroes and heroines from the Torah, Avram, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Moshe, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, and so on, kept the Ten Commandments, or more accurately, broke them? Because we always think about Moses breaking the Ten Commandments. But if you look carefully and you read the stories of Bereshit and Shemot and going through the Torah and the characters, and the Torah is a character-driven book, you discover that actually many of our characters, heroes, heroines, break the Ten Commandments. And let's go through, and I'll give you some examples, and you'll get the idea of what I'm talking about. So to make it more interesting, let's go backwards. Let's go from number 10, lo tachmod, not to covet, not to be jealous of another person's wealth or their partner, and so on. So, did anybody covet in the Torah? You bet. Leah did. Remember Yaakov's 2 main wives, Rachel and Leah? Leah coveted the fact that Yaakov loved Rachel, her sister, more. And she was jealous of that. And she desperately wanted the love that Jacob had reserved for Rachel. And when her son had these dudaim, these unusual plants, and she thought, and they were given to Rachel, and there was an opportunity for Rachel to want these plants from Leah, then Leah said, I'll give you the plants if I can have your husband for the night. Now clearly she's coveting the relationship that goes on. Yes, Yaakov would visit Leah, but he would be more with Rachel. So she's clearly coveting and paying for that coveting to do something. So that's a breaking of the Ten Commandments, number 10. What about the next one, number 9? Do not testify falsely. This is publicly in an actual court, not to make a statement that isn't true. Now, are there court cases in the Torah? Well, this is a bit more subtle, but you have to understand some of the stories in Bereshit actually contain a legal element to them when understood clearly. And a classic example, and you might be less aware about this, is the story of Yehuda and Tamar. Remember, Yehuda, after Joseph is sold, is quite upset and leaves from his brothers, and he marries a person not from our tradition, and he has 3 children, and the two older boys both die, and the wife of the first, who then marries the second, Tamar, is left without having any children, and Yehuda doesn't want her to marry the third son because maybe it's her fault that they're dying. There's a kind of worry that he had, and so she's left as a widow. So what does she do? She dresses up, and he meets her in the in a passageway on the road, and doesn't know who she is because she's all dressed up, and he pays to sleep with her like a prostitute, and in fact she gets pregnant. And he doesn't know it's her. And months later, they come along and say, Tamar has got pregnant. It must have been that she's sleeping around and she's not waiting for your third son. And he's very upset and says, who did this to you? Now, the fact is, back then, when it actually happened, Yehuda paid by giving his staff and an animal to her in payment. So Tamar is now in a state of testimony. And this is actually the way the Torah talks about it. And she holds up the staff and says, Hakena, I recognize that the person that gave me this staff, he is the person that got me pregnant. So she doesn't lie, doesn't not say who it was, but she allows Judah to take responsibility and admit that actually it was him. So that's a case of subtlety of, she doesn't lie, she doesn't bear false testimony. Okay? She is honest in her statement over here. Lo ta'neh be'avecha et shaka, you mustn't speak lie. She doesn't do that. She's actually very honest, but doesn't tell the whole truth, but allows Yehuda to say it. Another example of a haker now recognizing, again, but this time a bit more devious, is when the brothers come back with Joseph's coat. Because the father, Jacob, says to them, where is Joseph? What's happened to him? And that, they know that they'd sold him off to the Ishmaelites to be sold off to Egypt. But what happened to them to show their father it hadn't happened? They took that, his wonderful coat of many colours, and dipped it in blood, and said to the father, Hakena, look at this, look what must have happened, a beast must have taken him. And that is bearing false testimony. Yaakov actually concluded that's what must have happened. They didn't say they saw him die, but they concluded that what must have happened. So again, that's an example of a kind of false testimony, not telling the truth in a statement. And this phrase is actually discussed in Elon's book, Mishpat Ivri, that these are court cases in ancient Hebrew times of recognizing situations. Tamar had to publicly say who did it with him, and the brothers had to say, because they were responsible for Joseph, they had to publicly say, we are not responsible for losing him, so an animal got him, we are not responsible. So it's a kind of legal situation. In that sense, we have two stories of people not completely lying in court, but not completely telling the truth either. Shows a complexity. So that's our second of the Ten Commandments. Number 9, do not steal falsely. Testify falsely. Number 8 is lo tignov, do not steal. Who steals? Rachel. We've had Leah being jealous. Rachel stole. What did she steal? She stole her father's trafim, the Torah says, or idols, little idolatrous gods. When was this? When Jacob decided to go back to his family, and Rachel and Leah went with to go back. She stole from her father, Lavan. She took the trafim and hid them in her saddle. And when Lavan chased off and said, you've stolen things from me, where are they? Jacob didn't know about it. He says, what are you talking about? How dare you accuse me? And then Rachel, he wanted to search everything, and she said, look, it's my time of the month. I can't get off my saddle. And so he couldn't look under the saddle. So she stole. Now, yes, she was taking idolatry away from her father, which you could see as a good thing, but it's a clear story of her lying, and her husband, Jacob, doesn't know it. So that's a case of lying. And the Torah says, not to lie, not to steal, and she stole those trafim. Next, do not commit adultery. Does anyone in the Torah or ancestors actually do that? Actually commit adultery and be involved in that? Lot in af. So, well, here's what I understand. If you look at the story, there isn't a person that we know of choosing to commit adultery, but they definitely allow their partner to, twice. What am I talking about? The story of Abraham and Sarah. As soon as they arrive in the land of Israel, in chapter 12 of Bereshit, there's a famine, and so they have to leave, and they go down to Egypt, and Avram is afraid that he will be killed, so that the Egyptians, who don't respect necessarily his laws, will kill him because they think Sarah is beautiful. She was a very beautiful woman, and they would want to marry her, and they would kill off the husband so they could marry. So he says, say that you are my sister. And they do this whole ruse. Now, it works out okay because God intervenes and Abraham gets away with it, but he couldn't have assumed that. And what might have happened is that she would end up being married and sleeping with the Pharaoh, or another person actually ending up with the Pharaoh. So he would have allowed his wife to commit adultery in order to save his life. And he does that twice. Once in Egypt, and then once with Avimelech. And in fact, his son Yitzchak does a similar thing years later as well. So that's allowing the possibility of committing adultery. Next, number 6, do not murder. Lo titzach. Could anyone in the Torah, major characters, murder? Moshe did. Remember the story? He sees those. He sees an Egyptian taskmaster, Ish Mitzri, hitting an Israelite, and he tells him to stop, and he hits him, and as a result, he hits him so hard that he kills him. If you look at the verse, it's interesting. He didn't plan necessarily to kill him, but he hits him so hard, suddenly he finds he's dead, and he buries him in the sand. And the next day, two Israelites are fighting, and he tells them to stop, and they go, "Oh, you're going to kill us as well, like you did yesterday." And he finds out this murder is known, he runs away. He's afraid the Pharaoh is going to find out. So Moshe commits murder. Now, it might be to defend one of his people, and that was his step over the line to becoming an Israelite, but that's still an act of conscious murder in the Torah done by Moshe, who received the Ten Commandments. Interesting. Now, let's keep going. Number 5, Kibud Av Va'em, honoring your parents. Who is famous for doing that? Interestingly, the rabbis, and this is brought in the Gemara, and based on Pesukim, they say that the greatest honorer of a parent in the Torah is Esau, the way he treated his father. He would always honor and show respect for his father, and he had a high level of Kibud Av. But other rabbis say, actually, no, he didn't honor him. He just made it look as if he was being religious. He would ask difficult questions, demanding Isaac to think, Yitzchak to think that he was actually a religious and a devout and believer in God, but actually he wasn't. So the rabbis debate whether he was good at Kibud Av Va'em or not. So that's a challenge in the Torah as well. Number 4, keeping Shabbat. Does everyone in the Torah keep Shabbat? Well, there's an example in Bamidbar of a man who picks up sticks on Shabbat, breaks Shabbat, and as a result is killed, put to death for it. Now you might think, well, that's a bad thing, he's broken it. The rabbis think in the Gemara that man was Selofchod, the man who had 5 daughters, and because he'd passed away, they didn't have inheritance, and there's a whole question then in Bamidbar, who should get their inheritance. But some commentaries say, why did Selofchod pick up the sticks? He wasn't just breaking the Shabbat law, he wanted to make a point. This was just after the story of the spies, and we were sentenced to 40 years in the wilderness. And the generation knew that they weren't going to survive and enter the land of Israel. And they might have thought, well, what's the point of keeping Torah anymore? We're not going to make it to Israel. Our children will, but we're not. So why keep the laws anyway? And Selofchod, and this is an interesting argument the Gemara says, maybe what he did is, he said, I'm going to pick up sticks on Shabbat, I'll get punished for it, and they'll see that it still matters what you do, that it still matters to keep the laws of God. That's a bit of a circular, unusual way of arguing, but it shows that the rabbis are willing to entertain the possibility of someone breaking Shabbat for a positive purpose, to educate others. Really interesting. So that's an example of a famous person, Selofchod, breaking Shabbat. What about do not take God's name in vain? Do not take God's name in vain. And this is often in terms of blaspheming, just saying God's name, and there are a few cases of that in the Torah, but I want to do a different one of in a vow. We're told not to make vows and not to bring in God's name in a vow. And that's why, and we have Kol Nidre on beginning of Yom Kippur to annul any vow he might have accidentally made. But there's a very famous character who made a great vow in the name of God. And who was it? It was Jacob. Once he'd run away from his parents because he'd stolen his brother's birthright and Esau was out to kill him. And it's the whole story of the ladder, the beginning of the Seder of Vayishlach. Yes, that's right. Vayetze, beginning of the Seder of Vayetze, and the long story of the ladder there. Jacob makes a promise. He says to God, if you bring me back home safely, and I'm not hurt in any way, and I can go back to my family, then I'll give you 1/10 of all that I have. And he makes an oath in God's name. He takes what the rabbis now would say, God's name in vain. You're not supposed to make an oath in that way. So he did that. That's an example of another character, major character, one of the Avot, breaking the 10 Commandments. And the next one, do not serve idols. Not to have any idols. Who does that in the Torah? That you know. Who enabled an entire people to worship idols? None other than Moshe's brother, Aharon, when he enables them to build the golden calf. Now, some commentaries say he was trying to slow them down, and that's why he was doing it. But nevertheless, without him, there would have been no golden calf. And he asked them to bring their gold, and he threw it in, and it all came out. And he was punished for that, for being involved in that story. So he enabled idolatry. And finally, the first commandment, have faith in God. Know that God will look after you and to believe in God. Who doubted that? Well, that's all of us. That's the Israelites. So many times in the wilderness we doubted God. And the classic example is just after leaving Israel and leaving Egypt, and we come out of there and we've left, and it's in the Seder of Beshalach towards the end. And as a result of we doubt God. We say, is God amongst us or not? Because they didn't have food and they wanted to go back to Egypt. They said, Hayesh Hashem bekibenu im ayin, is God amongst us or not? And God is so upset by that whole story that then Amalek attacked them, and this is before the Ten Commandments. So it's a classic story of people doubting God. That is a failure of the first of the Ten Commandments. So I've gone through them all, and nearly all our famous characters, Avraham, Leah, Rachel, Aaron, Moshe, Selofchod, the people as a whole, are breaking the Ten Commandments. Now you see why they're in the Torah. It's not that they're original, that no one had thought of them before. It was the challenge of keeping them. God's Torah and laws gets involved in the messiness and the complexities of our lives and demands that we try and keep these laws even when it's difficult. You might say, I'll never steal, I'll never covet, I couldn't imagine committing murder. But scenarios take place, situations happen, and suddenly we find ourselves maybe not keeping some of these laws. That is the challenge, and that's why I think they're the Ten Commandments. It's talking to us in real terms. How are you going to live with these laws? Look at your lives and analyze. Are you right? Are you keeping these laws in the best way possible? And there's subtleties within each of the Ten Commandments of how we keep them. But that's the challenge. Now you might say, I don't think Rabbi Zarum is right about one of his Ten Commandments. I think he's analysed it wrong. I would give a different example. Great. Think of different examples. Maybe find alternatives through the whole Bible, Tanakh if you want, of characters who kept or didn't keep one of the Ten Commandments and what the reason is for it. And when you're analysing that, and when you're thinking about it for yourself and disagreeing with me, which I'm very happy for you to do, what are you doing? You're reflecting and understanding the subtlety and the importance of God's law, of the commandments that God gave us at Mount Sinai. Now that can't be a bad thing. And that might in fact be the point of the whole thing, to reflect and be more aware of the actions that we do and how we keep our faith with God. That's something to think about this year on Shavuot, and I wish you all a Chag Sameach.